Well, hi everyone. Welcome to the Curricular Analytics Community Information Session. My name is Stephanie, or Steph as I like to go by, Foot, and I am from the Gardner Institute, and I'm joined by several of my colleagues today, two of whom I have the good privilege of facilitating this community of practice, I guess we'll call it, with. Sometimes we call it an academy, sometimes a community of practice. It's all the things. So I'll let my colleagues introduce themselves. Brandon and Rob, who'd like to go first? Brandon.
There it is. Hey, everybody. I'm Brandon Smith. I'm an associate VP at the Gardner Institute, and we're really excited to be able to share a little bit about curricular analytics with you all. We've come a long way in the last couple of years doing this work, and so if you've heard a little bit about some of the curricular analytics work we've done in the past, we might have a few new things up our sleeve today to share with you. So I'll pass things to Rob.
Oh, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rob Rodier. I'm the Associate VP for Technology, Informatics, and Data Security. And you may see my cat here. I am also excited about this work. And I think we've been working towards where we are today for about 10 years. So it's always an ongoing process. We love to keep learning about it and can't wait to share. Steph.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rob. I just can't help but laugh when I see the cat.
Or the cat tail.
Exactly, the cat tail. It just really, really cracks me up. So for some of you, you may not yet know about the Gardner Institute. We are a 25-year-old organization, nonprofit, and we're located geographically in Western North Carolina, although many of our staff are dispersed around the country and also around the state of North Carolina, including myself. And at any given time, any of us could be anywhere because we have a lot of different things going on. So we're all over the place. But our focus at the Gardner Institute is on helping institutions ultimately to provide opportunities for all students to be able to graduate. So any student that we admit to our institution, we help institutions think about how they can support those students and graduate them so we can have more credentials out there in the world. And we do a lot in the areas of teaching and learning and retention and completion. And some of what we do at the Gardner Institute in those areas you'll find in the curricular analytics community, which we'll be talking about how the tools and the process can be used to help support retention and completion. But we also do lots of other things at the Gardner Institute. And at the end of the session, we'll highlight some of those for you. So first of all, we think, a really compelling reason to engage in this work, but I also know that each of you has a compelling reason why you're here and why you're interested in curricular analytics. And I would invite you to share that in the chat if you're willing. So what is it that has brought you here? What is your why? The opportunity here that's described in this piece that's featured from the Chronicle of Higher Education, we don't expect you to read it, the font's too small, but it highlights some of the work that institutions have done, initially the work that we built the curricular analytics community upon that helped to create clearer pathways, more transparent pathways, fewer blockers along the pathways for students to be able to graduate with a credential. So the answer to the question, is your degree program too complicated? Yes, it usually is if you analyze it. So we think there's a real opportunity here, and that's what we've based the curricular analytics community upon, this idea that many degree programs are too complicated, and often, students are reaching those complexity walls. And especially when we talk about transfer students, they're often reaching them right after transfer. So it becomes less easy for students to progress through general education and major requirements, and they have fewer options, especially if they're transfer students. So we know that there's a real opportunity here, and that's what we're trying to build upon in the curricular analytics community. So a little bit about the community itself and how it works. The curricular analytics community, as Rob said, has been evolving for about the last 10 years. We've done a lot of work in various different areas, but a few years ago, we began to use curricular visualization tools, and we built this process, which you will engage in if you decide to join us in the curricular analytics community. And it's an improvement science-based process, which Brandon will talk more about in a few moments. But during the academy, what you can expect is that you would use the curricular analytics tools that we have and the improvement science methodology to look at how you can identify problems of practice and engage in curricular redesign. So we don't expect any one person to tackle this. You would want to bring individuals from your institution, ideally faculty that teach in various academic programs, to come together and to learn with each other and to begin to use some of these tools to visualize and then move toward improvement. We have 7 synchronous meetings, and they range from an hour and a half to some of our shorter sessions, which are an hour in length, and all of the meeting recordings are posted in our learning management system, Brightspace. And then we offer ongoing support, technical and practice-based support, so institutions can get a lot of consultation and feedback from us during the process. And there's no limit to that, so you would just schedule meetings with us as needed beyond those synchronous meetings. And then, as I mentioned, you have access to a learning management system. That's one platform, but we also have a proprietary platform where we create the visualizations. And throughout the time that you work with us in the curricular analytics community, you have access to those. And then if you are working with us in other processes and services, you may have longer access to those. Just a little bit more about the approach that we take. These are the different areas in which we focus. And I'll give you a little sense of how we address them. And then again, Brandon will talk more about improvement science in particular. On the right-hand side is a visualization that shows the different phases of the work associated with the curricular analytics community. You know, we start by helping you to visualize your curricula. So we all know often our programs of study are presented in like a checklist format. So we may use those for advising. They're very static. We don't usually look at how these things play out, like look at the interplay between the courses and prerequisites. So prerequisites, co-requisites, courses. So that's what we do in the curricular with the curricular analytics tools. We're visualizing, we're looking at the relationships between pre and co-requisites. And as we're moving into that visualization, we're beginning to analyze using some of the tools and methodology that we'll introduce through improvement science. So it gives you an idea of what you can do as you're observing these problems of practice, as you're finding the blockers, as you're finding where students are really struggling to make it through. And then you begin to develop a plan. And then during the later sessions, as you're with us, you know, a little bit longer, so after the formal engagement, you begin to implement and study those actions that you're taking to know if the changes are really an improvement. So in the initial phase, we upload data. The data that we require for the curricular analytics community are programs of study. So these are publicly available data that come from your catalog and from advising guides. Upload those into our system to create the visualizations. And then we can also look at gateway courses, which Brandon will talk more about later. Then you begin to identify the problem. So we walk you through a process where you would identify the problem, and then you begin to identify sort of the areas where you want to focus in terms of the problem identification. And then you begin to look at the system, because our focus in the curricular analytics community is on the larger system and the smaller subsystems. We're not looking at individuals, we're looking at parts of our system that perpetuate the results that we're getting. And then we move toward creating driver diagrams where we identify the drivers for change, and then we begin to implement those within the Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle. So that's a very useful process because it takes us from talking the talk to walking the talk. So it gives us something where we can operationalize and be accountable, because we're identifying individuals and target dates and measures and metrics by which we'll evaluate the work that we're doing. And then at the end of our work together, you'll have a chance to share out what your plan is. So that's the presentation of artifacts and plan forward. So that's the approach and the focus. And now I'm going to turn it over to Brandon to give us a little bit more detail about the actual process and also a demonstration in the platform. Brandon?
Thanks, Steph. And thanks everybody for being with us today. We are really passionate about curricular analytics because um, this work, we think, is a new way in about talking about student success and really operationalizing um, changes. So when Steph's already shared a little bit about what this slide kind of, as an overview of, but it's essentially that we've never been able to visualize why and where students are hitting roadblocks quite the way that curricular analytics allows us to. The graph that you see there, and I know it's small, we'll go into a bigger version in a minute, um, shows prerequisite and co-requisite relationships. That's each circle is a class, each line is a connection. And everyone who's ever done this with us says, what's a good curricular complexity score? The answer is one that allows your students, more of your students to graduate, right? To retain and graduate. Because that number is neither good nor bad in isolation. It only matters as it relates to lagging measures like graduation rates, retention, uh, how many credits a student is graduating with, so excess credit accumulation, or even time to graduation. Those are really the four key indicators that help us know whether or not a program of study would be ripe for study here. And sometimes when we talk to folks, when we say, do any of those four apply? They say, yes, all four. So we know that's the case, but this is a really powerful way to get people using a framework that's similar. And the more you use it, the more quickly you'll be able to analyze and optimize student pathways, because it doesn't just generate a static image like you see on the screen, as you'll see in a minute. It's dynamic in its nature. So next slide, please. The approach, and Steph talked about this, we hope your institutional colleagues will spend more time on understanding the root causes that create an output like an undesirable persistence rate or an undesired graduation rate that will really, really, this doesn't include terms offered. Absolutely, Mark. Absolutely, we'll delve in it goes term by term which courses are there. But our hope is that rather than doing what we see so often, which is trying to find a solution in the literature or trying to find a solution and applying it sort of broadly to our systems, that your institutional colleagues will say, after looking at evidence, after looking at some data, we know that these are the courses where we have high restriction, right, related to curricular complexity, or here's our idea for innovation on how we can help more students get through our programs of study. That's the goal here. And then the improvement science methods let us test those ideas with fidelity. Next slide, please. So what is curricular analytics, right? It is a way of quantifying how complex the structures are related to those prereqs and co-reqs. And the way that's done is with those four elements you see there on the right. To Mark's question, each of the columns in that graph is a term moving sort of north to south vertically. And then there's complexity at the bottom of those based on terms, but I'll get into that in a minute when I share my screen. So the blocking factor is how many classes does this class block? It's just a sum, right? The delay factor is on the longest chain of classes, how many semesters exist? I say semesters, how many terms, right? So whether those are J terms, summer terms, however many terms, what's that longest chain? Why do those two things matter? The blocking factor matters because all those blocked classes are inaccessible. So the student's got to fill their class with something else if they haven't passed that class. The delay factor matters because as a student is either unable to enroll in a class, they have to drop a class, they don't pass a class, that delay is, there will be at least one more term for each of the times that they are unsuccessful along that pathway. So if you have a really long chain, there's a higher probability of excess credits or excess time to graduation. Centrality is all about how many roads in, how many roads out. A highly central course usually opens up lots of opportunity for students, and it's an important class because frequently it happens later in one of these chains, but it's still really of high importance. And then the overall complexity is the sum of the blocking factor and the delay factor. And then if you add that up across all the courses, you get it per term. If you add up all the terms, you get your overall complexity. So that's curricular complexity in a nutshell, but that's just the tool. A lot of people have built one of these and then say, now what? And that's where the improvement science comes in. So I hinted at some things that we're doing a little differently, and I think the next slide hints on this even further, but we recognize that some of these courses that occur early in a program of study block lots of coursework, right? The idea here that they're gateway courses. And what we were interested in doing about a year or so ago, some of our institutions that were doing this work helped us build maps using the exact same tool. Rather than a program of study, we said, what happens when we take one course across multiple programs of study, whether that's the whole school or just one or two programs? And that's where the primacy of these gateway courses really comes into focus. In some of the examples I'll show, we see that an algebra course could block 200 classes at your institution. And so again, when we think about the importance in supporting students successfully along this first step in the pathway, it's really critical. And so that's another variation that your institution can engage in, is mapping gateway courses and having deep conversations about how learning scaffolds, seeing opportunity for changes, and really thinking through how we help students succeed in these critical courses. So these are some examples of how this work is played out at a few institutions, and we just picked a few that were really diverse in their application. One institution mapped all the 2D and 3D art programs, and they had a couple of different examples of that. And what they did was they went through and recognized a couple of really important things, and they did this really quickly. They did this in a term of study and submitted it at the state level. But they went through and got rid of some what we call legacy prereqs that made sense in the past. But when the faculty talk about it now, they say, this might be an artificial filter for students, or it might just not even be necessary because we don't teach what we used to teach in that class. Additionally, they revised some prereq connections. They said it would make more sense for this course to connect here, or if we add this one learning outcome, then this chain really makes sense. And then they also added some early course offerings so that students didn't have some credit accumulation later on. So they added some courses that they really had wanted to teach, but they didn't have in the curriculum. So they made a number of really great changes that they were excited about. Engineering, frequently we see STEM going through this. A lot of the literature that exists is on STEM. With engineering, in this example, they were trying to solve for low completion and persistence rates within the major, especially for students from historically resilient communities. And they went a total different way than that 2D program. They realized that they needed to change some of their advising tools and really help students and the advising faculty understand why connections existed. They made some new measurements related to student readiness so they could really advise students to the correct pathway. And then they also looked at some support. But one of the big things that they realized in doing this work was that the current advising model was having students move between multiple physical campuses in a single day. And that was actually one of the problems, is that students weren't enrolling in the right class, in part because the travel was essentially impossible. And you would think, like, how did they not know that? It's just sometimes we don't all get together and talk through these things. With this biology example, and I'll move quickly, here they bust some myths related to advising and course sequencing. Literally, as the advisors looked at this, they said, well, that's not what we're telling them to do. And people were like, okay, well, let's talk about that. What they also found was that what they learned in one program, they were able to very quickly scaffold across multiple programs. Again, they removed some unnecessary prereqs and talked about where learning should be housed related to sort of the chain of learning. And then they also added some academic support in these really high bottleneck, high gateway courses, just sitting down and talking to the folks in those student support centers and trying to make it really clear what the learning goals were. Final, campus-wide, and we've seen a couple of different variations on this, but where an institution says, we're going to use this as part of program review, we're going to use this to help us make big decisions, related to how we might encourage a common framework for folks to analyze success in their programs. So the curricular complexity tool is just a really powerful way to do that when put with the improvement science work. At this institution, they analyze complexity and successful student success activity like capstones and things like that. They were able to really track where that went. And then they built some infrastructure to help their faculty and staff know what existed within certain programs, and even make some budgetary and planning decisions. So that's sort of how this is played out at a few places, but we just keep seeing people come up with really novel ways of using these tools. So these are the use cases we've talked a little bit about, but the one we haven't shown you, and I'll show you a graph on it in a minute, is so you can start by improving a program of study. That's the most common use case. Another that we've seen some really cool things done with is comparing the first time full-time student experience with those that transfer. And you can map that and you instantly see a difference. And then the final one is that gateway course variant that Steph alluded to and that I showed you a little bit about. So I'm going to jump in just a second, but before I do, I'm going to pause for questions. Have you can?
Oh,
Yeah,
sorry.
go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was reading the comment here, but please go ahead.
Okay. So since comparing transfer student with the first-time full-time student, do we also need to incorporate student data in order to do this?
Not necessarily, but you can. So I would say like you can. You can look at things like rates of Ds, failures, withdrawals, and incompletes. And what we've tried to do is set this up so that if an institution has high access to data, high data literacy, they can do this work. If they have lower access to data, we have sort of a scaffolded approach that allow folks to jump in. But even just looking at how the complexity moves, I mean, that's a great transition. Maybe I'll start with one of the transfer examples. Typically, when we look at, and this is our platform, sorry, this is the platform where all this lives. We don't see in a first time full time where a student's going to take a math class and then the first time they apply it is 9 terms later. That's pretty uncommon. But in this map, and this is an extreme example, but in this map, that's the reality. Those are the kinds of things that, at least at this institution, they did not, their articulation agreement showed essentially the student had taken all these classes and they started applying them in their second term, right? Another example, this is my favorite probably of all of them, is a student takes their initial chem class in this example, which they have to wait a year and a summer before they apply that learning again. And then when they finally do, they can't access any courses except this one in the first 2 years in their major if they have any kind of hiccups along this what we call complexity wall. So again, the first time full-time student, this is spread out across 8 terms. For the transfer student, by design, learning has to quote unquote wait, and that may or may not be correct. But even what we found in this example was it was unclear what was being taught in these chem classes for some of the faculty at the 4-year institution, and neither had the 4-year institution faculty made it clear to the 2-year institution faculty kind of what students should expect. So those were the kinds of conversations that resulted from this. So I don't know if that helps you kind of understand how the tool plays out for the transfer, but this is just one example. And it's usually pretty eye-opening. It's a great way for us to see the reality of what a student's experience is going to be. What else do we have in there?
Brandon, if I
Yeah, go
could
ahead.
add just before we get to Mark's question. So Emily, to create the visualization, the transfer visualization, you just need the program of study from your institution and either the sending or receiving. So whatever you are, and then where the student is either coming from or going to, depending what institution you're at. So that way you can create the visualization that shows the entire pathway. And as Brandon said, you could look at additional student data that could be layered in, but it's not required. So the only data that we're asking for the visualizations are the programs of study. But just looking at those, can really be illuminating, as Brandon is showing you. It's really eye-opening because some of these articulation agreements are very outdated, and even those that have been updated don't necessarily look closely at that, the point at which the student is applying the learning. So the complexity wall that Brandon has illustrated, the long chains that exist between, when students have taken the course initially because maybe they needed it for their associates versus, when they're actually applying it at the four-year institution is pretty dramatic in these transfer examples.
It's wild. It was so interesting for our institutional colleagues to build these out for the first time, because they said that can't be right. And then registrars and faculty and other folks looked at it and they're like, it is, and we have to change it. So there you have it. There's a couple of things in the chat. Let's see what folks say, and then I'll dig in here.
Yep, looks like there's a question from Mark and then also from Trisha.
Thanks. Yeah, you're right, Mark. Yeah, it's sometimes challenging to get folks to have these conversations. So as you're thinking about leaning in, trying to make sure the right people are in the room is critical. And Steph will talk more in a minute about who we recommend. And then Trisha, you're asking, are they built from the catalog? Yes. Building one of these is done with a CSV file, so in Excel. And typically, folks have a catalog open or a digital version of the catalog open, or they're advising, resources. And it takes around an hour and a half the first time. And the more of these you build, the more quickly they build out. So this, and it's not so much about the student enrollments, although that's part of the inquiry process, is asking things like, how often is this class offered? Because this is simply in an ideal world, the way you advise your students, how do they actually move through the coursework? I'm going to use this accounting example as a demo, but stop me if you have questions. Just unmute, please. So this is built with that CSV file. Again, to remind you what's really being visualized here. This is just the tool that launches us into all of the inquiry, right? But each circle is a course. Each line between circles is a prerequisite or a co-requisite relationship. And this one's nice and easy because it's saying how many courses are being blocked? 1, right? And you can see that right there. What's the delay factor? It's across 1, 2 terms. So 2 terms plus 1 blocking factor gives us our complexity of 3. That's how all of this is built. What you also notice is that on a given term, we have a complexity number. This is the sum of the complexity within any given term. And what we frequently see, when we think about first and second year students who are arguably some of our most at-risk populations, that's where a lot of the complexity lies in these programs, or for transfer students right after they transfer. And so the question is, what can we do about that? There's lots of things you can do. But one of the most interesting things about this tool that's probably worth showing you here in just a minute is that you can create copies, right? So I can create a copy, and in that copy, now I can do some sandbox what if scenarios. I can say edit curriculum, and let's say I want to reduce some of the complexity in this term because I notice there's really low complexity later in the major, and I wonder, well, maybe I could spread that across so these aren't such high stake terms. Well, this course, there's no reason it has to live in term 2. It could be in term 1, could be in term 3. So if I move it over, maybe even into term 4, where we're starting to get into lower complexity, or even term 5. Not only do I take this from being an 18-hour we've got, in both of these examples, we had 18 hours in the first 2 semesters for first years. That might be ideal, might not. But maybe what I want to do is move one of these electives over here if it still needs to be 18 hours. Or maybe what I want to do is move this over here. So the faculty, sometimes it's just as simple as saying, what happens when we start to move some of this stuff around to better distribute the complexity? Sometimes it's a question if somebody looks at this and they suddenly go, why do we still have accounting 305 connected to 311? That shouldn't be there. And so they go in here and they say, let's get rid of that connection. And so off it goes. And so on and so forth. So it's a really neat tool set that's not just a static graph, but it's a place that faculty and staff can go and start to really, once they understand what the numbers mean and what the complexity means, they can go in and really get creative on how they're delivering and scaffolding learning and moving things around so that we don't necessarily always have to remove courses or change what we're doing. Sometimes it's just a matter of saying, let's move a few things around so that we don't have all the complexity in the first two terms. So this is just a little example. We see institutions sometimes doing work like I've just explained, or sometimes just recognizing we need to change how we work with student support. We need to, add supplemental instruction to this class, or we need to add more this or more that. It just all depends. But that's the power of being able to be in a space to talk about this stuff and having the evidence in front of you in a new way. So there you go. Did I miss anything, Steph and Rob? I know I go through it so quickly because we do it so we all are
I want to ask my question
Albert.
about math and writing intensity,
Sure.
because what I found when students get off track, sometimes they'll end up having to take 4 writing intensive courses in a term, which is a recipe for disaster. Or you get the person who started out weak in math but decides they're going to take 5 math courses in a term because it's the only thing that fits in.
That's exactly the kind of thing, Mark, that comes up in the improvement science and the qualitative. We spend some time on those root causes. And so like what you just described, somebody would say, well, what evidence do we have, associated with that? And somebody would say, well, let me show you.
Okay.
And be able to kind of dig into that so that then what you're talking about might mean that we change some of our advising policy or practice, right? That's exactly the kind of problem of practice that somebody would bring to the table as part of this conversation. Look at the data and then make a plan of action using that plan, do, study, act to say, here's what we're going to do differently. We're going to have a one sheet. We're actually going to, check to see if students enroll in the correct course before the end of the term and it's too late, or whatever they think is going to solve the issue. And then you test it for fidelity. And it's like, did it improve things or didn't it? If it did, what does that mean for scaling up or scaling down? If it didn't, then maybe we say, that's not working. Let's try something else to solve this problem. So, but great example. What other questions do folks have?
Yeah, what other questions or comments do y'all have?
Yeah, I guess I've just been at negative institutions where it's next to impossible to get change. But I know, like with the registrar, all they were looking at was numbers. If we change this transfer agreement, we lose an enrollment. Doesn't matter if they succeed later on. And trying to get people to justify prereqs every so often. But I do think this gives a good argument for negotiating articulation agreements as opposed to transfer agreements.
Well, part of what we've learned is that there's really not a clean space for a lot of our colleagues to talk to one another. So our 4-year and 2-year colleagues in biology or math or English or any area, they actually would like to talk. In some cases to find out what's going on. But there hasn't been a space in place. And if there's appetite, this is a great way to do that. This is a great way to do that.
I think too, Mark, I'm not saying that every institution has changed because certainly we encounter those that are unwilling to change, but many more of them. are open to this because they want to see programs that graduate students,
Mhm.
and they're understanding that, we need to graduate more of the students we have versus, trying to spend time and resources recruiting new students, to start as first-time, full-time students, because we know there's a finite amount there of those students. So I think we found more institutions are willing to have the conversation and to look at this because, they want to successfully graduate students in these various programs. And if they can't, then they want to right size the programs. So I think it's important, especially now, to make those decisions and to do it using a process where faculty have an opportunity to weigh in and to be involved in decisions. And that's really what these tools can do, to be frank. All right, why don't we talk about who might be involved in this work? We've already alluded to a lot of people who can be involved in the work, but we'll share a little bit more detail about that. And then, of course, we invite you to continue to ask questions and make comments related to what we're talking about here. So who should participate? We know that this work needs to be done in teams. And as I mentioned earlier, the team should include the faculty who are involved in teaching the courses that are in the programs of study. So it would be great to have representation because the faculty who are teaching in these programs have the ability to make some changes, even if it's not just them making the changes. If these changes have to go through curricular committees, they still have the power to bring those changes forward. And then there's a lot that can be done, as Brandon said, that is within their locus of control. And then there are also things at the institutional level too that will come to light. So it's important too to have individuals who can affect change at that level. So anyone from academic affairs or dean's offices can help to advocate for those sorts of changes. Admission staff, as we've talked about, those who are involved in transfer articulation can also be great partners in this work. IR staff can be great because although we're not asking for student level data, the fact that you all are engaged in this work will often trigger the desire for more data, and institutional research staff can provide that. So there are a lot of questions that will come up that can be answered through institutional research data or through data from your system office too that might be available. Faculty leaders, as we've talked about, retention staff, student affairs staff, student success, and students. We've had a number of students that have been involved in the work, including a lot of students working behind the scenes, getting these programs of study uploaded into the platform to create the visualizations. We've had fantastic partners who have done that work for the institutions that have been involved, several of them. So that's just an idea of who might be involved. And in the description, it says at least 5 people, but you can have up to 15. That's sort of the guardrail for the team size. So anywhere between 5 and 15. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Katie to talk more about the logistics.
Thanks, Steph. So we have here the synchronous meeting date and times. And I just want to mention that all of the synchronous meetings are recorded so that if everybody from your team isn't available, they can watch the recordings after the fact. It starts March 27th and the coursework finishes on May 6th, but the community of practice goes for a year. The fees are based on your undergraduate enrollment as determined by College Navigator. There are different bands here listed, and those fees can be split into 2 fiscal years. And the application process is simply 4 questions. And I think the last time we did one of these, somebody asked us how competitive it is. And those questions are not meant to be tricky. They are really meant to make sure that your goals match the goals of the community of practice. So just 4 simple questions to make sure that our goals are aligned with each other. The process and academies, here's a list of all the different things that we do. And I'm not going to read them or go through and describe each one of them, but I will say that there are a lot of different areas that we focus on in student success. And sometimes we get people who sign up for 3 or 4 different info sessions and are unsure exactly where they want to focus. And the best way to do that is to just sign up for a conversation with some Gardner Institute staff, and we can understand your goals and help make sure that you are at the right academy or community of practice. So the applications are at that website listed here, platforms.gardnerinstitute.org. If you have any questions or would like to set up a meeting, please email us at info@gardnerinstitute.org. That comes to me. If I can't answer your question or set up a meeting, I will make sure that you get to somebody who can. And I did want to take, because Steph, you were talking about those gateway courses, I did want to mention one thing we have coming up that is sort of a one-off. In March, here in Asheville, North Carolina, we are having a 2-day workshop called Transforming the Gateway Experience. Stephanie will be part of the team leading that, and it's a 2-day workshop really focusing on a book that our CEO Drew Koch recently published, and focusing on redesigning those gateway courses. So that's something you're interested in. I would say the early bird deadline has just been extended to Wednesday, the 26th. So we really recommend that you you sign up if you're interested in that. So now I'll let you go to questions. Thanks, Steph, for letting me do my little ad there.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for doing that plug. We appreciate it. I put the information about the workshop in the chat. There's also one in May on the transfer student experience, which might also be relevant to this particular group.
Absolutely. Thanks.
You're welcome. So what questions or comments do you all have for us? And we can stop the recording so you can answer, and we can hang around if you'd like to just answer or ask a question, have us answer personally.
Have you ever how do you get the president or a trustee or two to take this as a champion?
Mm-hmm. A good question.
Instead of getting on early on and saying, how are you doing? Making sure it's continually reinforced that it's important.
Brandon,
part of our transformation work, we've got a opportunity right now called Transforming the Foundational Post-Secondary Experience, which is essentially access to everything that the Gardner Institute does over a 5-year period, where institutions do a deep dive on essentially how they'd like to redesign student success at their institution over an extended period of time. And that's been one of the ways where we've seen some of the leaders, provosts, presidents lean into this work and say, this is a priority for us. Additionally, in fact, I was just talking with the provost about this earlier. Well, I guess it was last week because today's Monday. But when the provost either comes to meetings or when someone says, I'd like to see the presentations at the end of this work, those kinds of things, that really makes a difference in how people engage in this work. And so whenever possible, we think it's great for folks at the end of this process to be able to share that back with a larger faculty group, with leadership at the institution, because it's important to recognize not only the work that's been done, but also the learning that occurs throughout this process. So that's my response. That's where I've seen probably the greatest institutional involvement is when folks are engaged in this transformation work and they see it as one part or one driver in an even larger student success effort. And that's what this is. This is one way to advance student success, and in many cases that hasn't been tried yet at most institutions.
Other questions or comments? Oh, Brandon and I have worked together so long, we just speak for each other and in unison.
Thank
Well,
you.
we'll go ahead and stop the recording. Yep, we'll stop the recording and we can hang out for a couple more minutes if there are any other questions.